Okay, so I want to take this opportunity to go through the projection strategy for this ground element. This is quite probably the most complicated element of the entire projection. We can see that I've eliminated all the other geometry, and we're now focusing just on this ground. Just to summarize the basics of it, this is essentially a village square. This is a sort of a courtyard here. We can see that as this pans around, we've got a kind of a crossroads. We've got this road coming up here. There's a slight incline on the road, sort of a camber on the road. The road sort of goes off in and then veers off towards the left in this direction, and then obviously we've got the crossroad. And if we come towards the beginning, we can see the road sort of coming in this sort of underneath the camera effectively and out. So within this we've got sort of these four sections are sort of elevated. We've got this curb with a little bit of pavement, we've got this curb sort of dropping down to the road, and we've got that on all four sides. So this is kind of like a platform that drops down, as is this that drops down, etc. So that's the nature of this geometry, and obviously we need to find a good way of projecting a texture onto this, which is going to work through this quite sort of expansive camera move, where we've got the areas of the ground coming very, very close to camera. We've got a lot of movement on this, so we've got potentially a lot of scope for distortion of the textures, possible doubling of the textures onto unwanted areas, geometry, and so I wanted to kind of go through the way that I approached the testing really of my camera configuration. So I want to start with this first area, which is this area on the left. Okay, so I'm just going to disconnect that texture temporarily so we can see this. This area, obviously we're looking down on this courtyard area. This area is going to be cobbled. There'll be a slight pavement edge that we see going around the sort of peripheries, and then cobbles on the inside. We're quite close to it, and we're looking at it at a bit of a glancing angle from the first frame of the shot camera. I always like to project from the path of the shot camera wherever possible. I think that gives you the best possible view of your scene. But there are occasions where you need to break from the camera path, particularly in order to get sort of a slightly better angle and slightly better perspective. And because we're dealing with cobbles here, and obviously they're three-dimensional elements, I don't want to be looking at those in quite this sort of shallow angle. I want to be looking at them a little bit steeper. So I want to just go through the process by which I created this camera position. I'll just jump into the 3D view so I can show this camera position as opposed to the shot camera. So if I just swizzle around here, we can see that this is the shot camera and this is actually my projection camera. So it's pretty much on the first frame of the camera path. But what I did is I just sort of brought it back a little bit and just angled it down. So if we just take a look at that's the view from the shot camera. I'll actually just put wireframe onto I've got wireframe on there. What can I do to make that a little bit easier to see? Possibly just disconnect it. So no, that's not really helping either. Okay, I'll persevere. So that's the shot camera, and this is the left-hand camera. So you can see that it's brought back a little bit and it's angled a little bit more down. So the angle by which we're going to be looking at these cobbles is a little bit steeper. It's just giving me that little bit more of an orthographic view of the cobbles, and therefore we should actually see a little bit more definition in the masonry effectively. Okay, so just to show how I go about this, so I'm just going to break that off and I'll show how I go about creating this. The key to doing this kind of thing is to do these kind of things in what I call a non-destructive way, a way that gives you the flexibility to be able to try different configurations, and that's certainly what I did in this case. So to do that, what I would do is I'd make a copy, just Control C and then Control V of my shot camera, And again, what I could do, if we look at my shot camera, we can see there that as I scrub through there, you can see that there's translation and rotation properties there, which you'd expect because obviously it's a moving camera. I could right click here and say no animation, and that's outside the screen boundaries. No animation on all knobs, which would kill the animation. But I might find that shooting from projecting from from frame 3 or frame 5 might be a little bit easier for this. So I don't want to sort of throw these keyframes away. But to test them, obviously, I am going to need to sort of lock them off at on particular frames. And the node that allows me to do that is the frame hold. So if we take a look, this is the frame hold, and I can set the frame. So I'm just leaving that on the first frame, which is frame 0. And that means that now that camera isn't going to move. I'll just give this a distinctive colour, just so we can distinguish it from any others. So that is giving me my new shot camera position. So that is now it's called shot cam 2. I'll just call it test for now, so we can see that in the 3D environment. If we take a look at it, just zoom out a little bit so we can see this. So we can see there's my original camera, and this is my test camera. So hang on a second, I'll just see this. There's the test camera. Yeah, there it is. And we can see the slight difference in the path, and that's what I want to kind of quickly go through the way that I actually set out to achieve this. I'm just going to take that projection off the scene so that we're just looking at the cameras for now. Okay, so this is my test camera. This is the one that I actually ended up with. So you can see I brought it back a little bit and just angled it a little bit more, so it's looking down a little bit more steeply. You can see with the camera frustum there, compared with the shot camera, that it's just angled down a little bit. It gives me a slightly more orthographic look at the cobbles, or where the cobbles will be. Okay, so the way to go about this is to use an axis node. And an axis node is it's basically a null object. It's never seen or anything like that in the scene. We connect that up to the camera. And I just need to zoom out so we can just see this. You can see that when you put an axis in, it actually locks itself into world space 0. Now that's unhelpful in terms of using this to control the camera, because essentially what it means is that if I start to, now I've got this connected to the camera, if I now start to move this, you can see that I can actually use this to control the camera and alter the position and the rotation of the camera. And the reason why, obviously I could do that within the properties of the shot camera, but the advantage of doing it with the axis is it's completely non-destructive. If I don't like it, I can just disable it or delete it and replace it with another one. I could eventually have a stack of axis nodes here that I'm using just to test different configurations, so it's really flexible. The problem is that it's not helpful for the axis to be pivoting from world space 0 when the camera is in a different place. So the trick to dealing with this, I'll just empty my bin of properties and open up the axis and the projection camera. The trick here is to get the projection camera and basically connect the position of the axis to that. The way to go about it is basically just to take the translate properties there. I will have to turn that off so that I can actually get at my properties. And if I just hold down Control and then just drag down my translation properties down onto the axis and drop them on the pivot attribute, you can see that that now assumes the same properties as the shot camera, which means that as the shot camera is moving, as is the axis. So that's a really important thing. And then from there on in, I can now use my axis. I can use the translation properties on my on my axis to do what I was talking about, I can even use the gizmo. So just sort of to bring it back a little bit, and as I said, maybe just tilt down with the rotation. That's the wrong axis. And tilt down. And essentially that's how I came to create this. You can see there's the actual camera as opposed to the one that I've just created. Now you can see it's a little bit off, but you can see how I got to where I got to where I did with this particular view. And obviously with them when we look at this through the frame hold. So if I connect now to the Project 3D where the frame hold's taken place, so that camera is locked and not moving, you can see that how I've kind of created that situation. And if I look at that through the test, I will need to just reconnect my geometry to the scene, and you can see that that's what it looks like when I'm looking at it through my test camera. If I disable my axis node, you can see the difference. So that's how I went about it. That's obviously not the accurate setting, but that's how I went about creating this camera. And once I've created this camera is actually doesn't have any keyframes. It is actually a locked off camera now. It's the one that I settled with and finalised, and so therefore it's had everything taken off. It's had the axis node baked on. It's had the keyframes removed, etc. The frame mold's been removed, and so on. So this is now what we're looking at through the left-hand camera. And I basically use this same approach on all three of the cameras that I use to kind of create this projection. Okay, so moving on then to actually sort of starting to test the projection for suitability. I've shown in previous using checkerboards in NUKE in previous videos, which works okay in some situations. It's not that helpful in this particular situation because in order to basically get a patchwork of projections in different areas of this, we need to use several different images, and we need to know where to delineate those with the alpha channel. Because, for example, this courtyard, I want to limit this area just to this courtyard, then my alpha channel is going to be going along the line of that pavement. So the way that I would go about that, or the way I did go about that, was basically to take this camera and the geometry out of NUKE by basically converting them into an FBX and then taking that into a 3D application and doing a render. So if I go to my left-hand view, this was this was done in Cinema 4D, and this is a render of the floor element from that particular camera's perspective. I did this in 3D because I wanted some additional passes. You can see, for example, there's a specular pass, which in this particular case is turned down on its opacity. By default, it's way up here, way too bright. And I've also put some lights in the scene. There are some street lights, and there's a kind of imaginary town hall here on the far left that's off screen, and I wanted to kind of create some lights projecting from these, so I've put some lights in the scene. These are not for now, but these are for later, and you can see that they are creating some illumination that I can use later on. There's also an ambient occlusion pass, which is giving me some self-shadowing, and there's also a material pass, which is giving me an alpha. It's not really much use in this particular one, but in some of the other projections this is really important. It's a really important element. And this is my alpha. So you can see the alpha there is essentially cutting off right at the point of that intersection there, where the edge of the curb sort of disappears from view, and we're seeing beyond that to the road. Okay, so that is my starting place, and this is always my starting place, is to create this kind of render, bring it out of the 3D application as a single frame into Photoshop like this with all my different passes, and then start to paint in Photoshop. In this particular case, I just wanted to do a quick test, so I just put a checkerboard projection, and the checkerboard I just created myself. If I just jump back into NUKE and come down, you can see here all I did was just create a checkerboard, which is just a default pattern inside NUKE. I put a 4K resolution on it and wrote it out as a JPEG, and then brought that into Photoshop and then just used the deformation tools just to sort of position it, lay it down. I've also just put a red texture over the top of that and just blended it with a multiply node, which is perfectly adequate for this. And that's going to give me obviously it's going to create that red pattern, which is helpful. Everything else can go off. So and obviously that area, that checkerboard area, is isolated by the alpha channel. Okay, so that is the pattern. Later on, then, once I know that this is working, I can actually start to progress with some confidence and start to actually perform the painting. And just to give you a little bit of a preview of that, this is kind of where I started off. I just found this texture that was of this kind of, it's not how I want it, but it was, the perspective was fairly close to what I was looking for in terms of these curves. I did have to distort it a little bit, but the curves aren't bad, and I'll probably use this. Obviously, I'll be putting cobbles in this inner area, but I'll probably use these curves because they're actually quite close to what I want. Obviously, I've got to patch this area here, but this is a starting place. But for now, I'll dispense with that because that's obviously moving on a little bit further than what I wanted to go. This is my starting place, is to make sure, before I actually commit to doing any paint work in Photoshop, to make sure that this projection is going to work. So I take this Photoshop file into NUKE and test the projection. So essentially what that means is that I'll just hook up to the scanline renderer and then connect here. So what's actually happening here is that this camera, which is the one I've just been talking about how I created it, this is going through a projection shader, and my image, this is the Photoshop file that I've just shown, this is coming in and it's projecting via this camera onto the geometry, and this is what we're getting. So if I just take the wireframe off here and just clear my panel to come back into 2D, we can see, actually it's not that helpful, I do need my wireframe on so we can see the boundaries. And essentially what I'm doing now is I'm just testing the projection. Already I can see a little issue, which I'll come on to, but all in all, I'm really happy with the pattern. Even though I just laid it down really roughly, I'm not that bothered about the resolution at this stage. I'm just looking for any sort of smearing of the texture, which we'd see if, for example, this checkerboard pattern, if the checks were elongating in any particular direction, that would indicate that the texture's been stretched, and it isn't. It's maintaining its integrity really well all the way through there. What there is a little bit of texture doubling, and we can see that just here where the texture is being doubled onto the road. We can see that from this projection area it's not quite on shot camera 1. We know that we moved it back and tilted it a little bit, but this area of the road isn't visible from that particular camera perspective. Same with that little bit of the road along that leading edge. But what we can see, if I just take it out of Proximo so it's slightly better resolution, what we can see is as the camera progresses around, the texture that's projecting onto this surface is doubling through onto the road, and that's not a problem. That just means that that's going to need to be patched from a camera that's more from this direction, more looking at the scene from this direction. So that is going to involve a little bit of a patch later on to deal with that area there that's doubled onto the road there, and also a little bit that's doubled onto the road sort of along that edge. As I said, that'll be patched from a different camera position, so it's not a problem. So I'm happy with that projection. I'm happy that that's going to work, and that's going to give me the confidence to go into Photoshop and actually commit to doing this kind of detailed work, or more detailed work, knowing full well that that projection is going to actually sort of transfer through into the shot. Okay, so just moving on, I'm not going to spend anywhere near as much time talking about the way that I sort of set up the camera, but I'm just going to bring in the second projection, which is this one. I'll just disconnect that and bring this across. I'll put it into position, and this is my second projection, and this is the middle area. So if we just take a look at this, we can see what's going on. What I did here is I'd established that I wanted a camera that was looking straight down the street. That was going to give me the best possible sort of perspective of this. It was going to give me a good coverage all the way around, nice perspective here. So that's going to give me a good area of coverage. Again, I wanted to get a little bit more of an angle onto this to get a more orthographic representation. I did it in exactly the same way. I put an axis node on, made a duplicate of my shot camera at, in fact it was this frame, it was frame 61, or I think, or frame 65, I can't remember, but it was one of those frames. It was one of these sort of central, looking straight down the street. So again, I put a frame hold on that so that I could change and try different approaches. And then I used an axis node just to break it from the camera path and just sort of tilt it a little bit. That gave me a little bit more of this foreground element where I was losing a little bit of resolution. So the slight tilt just gave me that little bit extra there, but obviously I'm getting this nice view down the street, and obviously there, not too worried about that because I've got buildings on this right hand side that obscure that. We just maybe just see this little area here. We see more of that, and again the size of the pattern is really arbitrary. If we take a look at my at this, you can see that I did this really crudely, just using the same checkerboard pattern, but just using several instances of it. I just wanted to keep the pattern fairly square, so that I was starting off with an undistorted pattern, so that I could, as I'm looking through this as it's playing out, I can see if there's any real elongation of the textures, which there isn't, then I'd be able to see it at this point. Again, I'm not really interested in resolution. This does not represent resolution. This is just the way that I really crudely put this together. It's not important. And again, we've got an alpha channel on here. This is a really crude alpha channel. I just painted it with a brush. All I wanted to do really was just get that leading edge there, open up the area of the street so that we can actually see that part of the cobble as it goes down there. So, and all this area in the white is opaque. This is all visible to the projection. We know full well that this area is going to be covered over by the cobbles, and this area is going to be covered over by another building. So it doesn't really matter. So this is fairly crude, really. And again, this is projected. I went through the same approach as I've already said with this. To establish the position, try different configurations, and then this can now be merged with the other projection. And to do that, we use this node called the merge material. You can see it's like a normal merge node, except it doesn't have anywhere near the properties. You can see there it doesn't have a great deal of operations. It doesn't have a great deal of control. But all it allows us to do is merge one material over another. In this particular case, I'm merging the left hand, the cobbled area, over the top of that, because obviously we've got an area that was in Photoshop that I just left. So just go back to this. All this area here was just left, so that's all this area on the left side is actually visible to the projection. But I know it's been obscured by other elements later on, so I don't really need to concern myself with it. Hence the reason why the alpha on this is really sort of quite crude. Okay, so we can see that is projecting quite nicely. We can see that area of doubling there onto the road, and we know that we're going to have to patch that later on with another camera. But you can see that that's actually sort of transferring very nice. We're not seeing any smearing of the pixels. It's maintaining its coverage. It's maintaining its perspective as we go around there. Maybe a little bit just there, which we may need to deal with on that curb edge, maybe a little bit of the road. We can also see that as it's coming around, it's also revealing an area of the road where there isn't really any, where I didn't put my pattern. I'm gonna need to make sure that I actually either patch that area with cobbles or paint additional texture onto this. I'll probably do the former rather than the latter, but that's giving me the confidence to be able to go ahead and paint. And again, just as a little bit of a preview, you can see that I've actually started that process here, and I've actually started to sort of to photo bash this these elements in, and I'm really only concerned with the cobbles. But I'm getting a nice pattern there, which in order to test. And again, I can come back to my projection and just show the consequence of that testing. And I'll just come back to this and put this on as well, so we can see the two elements coming together, and maybe just start thinking about taking off that wireframe now, so we can start to see this. And we can see there that that's coming around quite nicely. Okay, that area really is grotesque, but obviously it's we don't commit to a great deal of painting until we know this is actually going to work. You can see that area of projection there that's going to need to be done. You can see how that's smearing down. You can see this pattern here is that, so that's doubled onto there. This corner here is doubled there, so that pattern there doubled. So we can see that that's doubling in from the actual sort of platform down onto the road that's slightly recessed. So that's definitely going to need to be done. Okay, so that's the second projection done and happy with. Again, I'll just hook up there, and I'll just very quickly go through my final projection, which is the right side. And the purpose of this is purely to just replace or put back those curbs and a little bit of the pavement that I lost when I was when I was putting the alpha from that sort of central area back in. So if we just take a look at this. Whoops. I'll just take that back. Got everything there, and I just want that. Bung that in there. And again, this is the same as before. The right hand projection. So if we take a look at this, this is the angle that it's looking at it. And again, this is a variation of shot camera from the very first shot camera frame, except I've taken it quite a bit higher to give me much more of a sort of direct angle of that. And again, what I'm looking to achieve here is I'm looking to get this edge and this edge of the curb and these little bits of pavement that are adjacent to it, and again this leading edge here of the curb and a little bit of the pavement here. I'm looking to get those from this projection. And if we take a look at it, I'll come out of the OpenGL view and back into 2D view so we can see this. We can see that on the first frame it's very nice. The matte is tight to the curb. So if we take a look at that, we can see that that's sort of fairly tight along this curb edge. And all I did is just lay down a very basic pattern. You can see it's elongated. That's just happened when I was laying it down. So we know there's already some stretching of this, but that doesn't matter. That's not going to affect the paint. This is going to be removed when the paint starts. So we can see what the pattern looks like by default. And then when we look at it in here, we're looking for any significant stretching of beyond that sort of default pattern, and we can see that it holds together pretty well, and we can see it comes round nicely. It's following the integrity of the pavement line, so it's really quite nice. What I did notice is that there's a little area around about frame 20 where we're actually seeing the boundaries. What this tells us is that I'm going to need to bring a camera back and angle down in order to patch some of these areas that are really underneath the camera, because there is some loss of coverage just there, which is going to need to be patched over. But in terms of getting this curb back and that edge there, this is actually giving me a good deal of confidence that that's going to be working out, and that translates through when I put my my initial projection on there. So again, if I just come back to the first frame, you can see exactly what it's giving me. It's just giving me that that edge, that little bit of pavement, those curbs there, and the little bit of pavement. It's just giving me this this little area there. So, and the Photoshop file exactly the same. So that's what it kind of looked like from the off. And I just put the texture in along that. I just put it in really crudely, and then masked it with the alpha channel. So even though it actually protrudes beyond into the street, it's cut off by that sort of tight alpha. Okay, so that is pretty much it. I think what I've got here is I've got a starting place for a projection here. I can look at it through. I can probably see the faults. I'll start to see loss of coverage, for example, happening just here, which is going to need to be patched. I can see the doubling happening here that's going to need to be patched, and the same along that edge there. But in terms of actually sort of getting a starting place on this ground, we can see I've got a little bit of area up there which is going to need to be patched. So I may be able to do all this from a single patch camera, and then we know that there's an area of the road that goes around it to the left where there currently is no coverage. That's going to need to be patched in. Again, I mentioned doing that from this back camera, because that gives us the best view around that corner. But that's it. That's the projection strategy sort of described in terms of how I plan to proceed with this. So hope you found that useful. If you're doing a camera projection strategy of your own, I hope that you're able to sort of take some of these principles into the execution of that. It's quite tricky doing grounds, particularly where there's got a lot of perspective change. There's particularly where the camera is very close to certain elements. You know, you always get it. You always get issues. You always have to solve the problem that presents. It's there's no sort of one size fits all to this. But that's my strategy. So I've got 3 projection cameras. They're going to be supplemented with at least 1, possibly 2, maybe even 3 patch projections to deal with the various elements that I've described elsewhere. But from here on in, I can pretty much go ahead now and paint these 3 elements up and get them to a state of completion. I won't do that. What I will do is I'll probably get them to sort of the next stage of development and then put them in and test them again, and I'll probably do that all the way through the process. But I'll produce additional videos to look at that. Probably not quite as long as this one, 33 minutes for goodness sake. Anyway, that's me done. Hope you found it useful.